Mark chapter 1 is where we're going to be. Encourage you to go ahead and get turned there. Mark chapter 1. So as we come now to Mark chapter 1, and once again, the introductions are finished, the baptism is over, the temptations in the wilderness have now ceased. Some of the apostles have already been chosen and selected, and now, finally, as we get down to verse 21, Mark's recording of the ministry of Jesus is now underway. But where Mark begins specifically is very important for us to understand, especially if we're going to accept Jesus as our Lord. Well, and follow Him, of course, but even more so if we're going to accept Jesus as our King. For Jesus to be accepted as King, and this really ties back into what we've been talking about on Wednesday nights, He has to have the power over the king of this world. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, I told you that this morning, Paul refers to Satan as the little g god of this world. And Christ must have the ability to overcome Satan, to break that stronghold, stranglehold that Satan has on sinners. And so Mark begins the ministry of Jesus with the Lord overcoming a demon. Immediately after he overcomes Satan in the wilderness, having that power, displaying that power over the spiritual realm. And this is going to be seen multiple times over his 3-year ministry, because it is essential for the Lord's authority to prove His power over this realm. So our section this afternoon is going to be Mark 1, verse 21 through 28. We're going to read this section as a whole, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into each of the individual verses. And even then, we're going to do those in blocks as well. All right, verse 21. Then they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. And they were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. Now there was a man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, "Let us alone. What have we to do with you, Jesus of Nazareth? Did you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be quiet and come out of him." And when the unclean spirit had convulsed him and cried out with a loud voice, he came out. And then they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? What new doctrine is this? For with authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And immediately his fame spread throughout the region and around Galilee. So I hope when we read a passage like this, I hope that there's a few different things that jump out at you. First and foremost, of course, is always the power of Jesus over the spiritual realm. But also the fact that he's hitting the point now in his ministry where the fame is starting to spread. But in this lesson, and arguably most pertinent to our lives in this world today, really is the response to Jesus. Two separate responses, and it was a different response to Jesus between the demons and the response of the people to Jesus. It was two very separate responses. And here's what I mean. The passage tells us that the people were amazed. What it means is it caught their attention. And yet the demons were terrified. In fact, the demons just panicked in the presence of Jesus because they know who Jesus is. They knew who Jesus was before he took on flesh. They knew who Jesus was before they got kicked out of heaven. And so it's the same response in Mark 1, Mark 3, Mark 5. Every time over this 3-year ministry that these demons are in face-to-face with Jesus, this is what happens. Every time. The Bible tells us, in fact, that they scream when they're before him. But it's ironic, too, that throughout Mark's gospel, we're going to go all the way through the first half of the gospel. And at that point in time, the demons are the only ones who know who Jesus really is. We're halfway through the gospel before we get to Peter's confession. But they are terrified. So I want you to understand something in that statement alone, that they're terrified. Do you understand that should be the case? That in the presence of the Lord, the demons should be terrified, but really sinners should be terrified, period, as a whole, because Jesus is the authority. Jesus is the one that's going to condemn the unrepentant, all the while those who are repentant are running towards the Lord. But sinners, unrepentant sinners, should be terrified of Jesus. So it's no wonder that the demons were terrified. And here's really the dichotomy between these two. You've got demons who are terrified and they can't be saved. There's no salvation for them. But the irony is you've got the people who are absolutely amazed by what Jesus was doing but would not be saved. And the end result for both of them is the same. They're both going to spend eternity in hell. When salvation was there for the taking and they just wouldn't take it. So as we get into verse 21, the Lord's ministry is now underway. He's now moving. And again, Mark jumps past Jesus' Judean ministry. He starts in Judea before he goes to Galilee, and he's going to end back in Judea. But he jumps straight to the Lord's baptism, straight taking us to a very familiar place, a place that should jump in your mind as soon as you hear it. Verse 21, they went into Capernaum. And then immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue. Capernaum is a city you hear about so much. It's on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee. But we know Capernaum because it's going to be a home base for Jesus, where he's going to do the majority of his ministry. Not his hometown, Nazareth, because the Bible tells us he wouldn't be received in his hometown. And in fact, when he does go to Nazareth, they try to take him and throw him off a cliff. So Capernaum, literally Capharnaum, is the actual word for it. And I told Melissa, as much as I've studied about Capernaum, I learned something new about that I never actually understood before. Capernaum, Capharnaum, actually means the village of Nahum. Nahum being the Old Testament prophet Nahum. So it goes all the way back. This city has a very long historic tradition. Now, part of Capernaum's prominence is in its beauty. It still is a very beautiful place. But Capernaum is a crossroads city with lots of travelers. Whether you go north, south, east, west, it's right there on the Sea of Galilee, which makes it easy for trade across the sea. But because of that, because of the immense travel, the people coming in and out, Capernaum is a very sinful place. They are a long way from Jerusalem. They are a long way from everything holy epicenter of Jewish worship. Being the Sabbath, Jesus immediately, when he comes into Capernaum, he enters into a synagogue. Luke 4 tells us, as was his custom. So this is what he would do. Synagogue is just a fancy word that means meeting place. If there were more than 10 Jews in an area, they would have a synagogue. And so it was like a local congregation, a little small get-together. They were small, they were not overly glamorous, because the primary worship was to be in Jerusalem at the temple, where they had to go 3 times a year for the males back to the temple. And so these synagogues were for teaching, advising, helping. They would be schools. All these different things would take place. And it's interesting, when you read through the Old Testament, there is no mention of a synagogue. But being in captivity, where synagogues actually come from, being in captivity, what would happen is, while they were in Babylon, they would get together and meet in small groups to still be able to worship and study and talk about God while they were in captivity. And so once the captivity ended, they came out of Babylon back into Jerusalem. Well, they brought this notion of synagogues with them. So at this point in time, in and around Galilee alone, are over 200 synagogues. I mean, they're everywhere. Now, what these synagogues would do, on a normal Sabbath, the elders of that synagogue would speak and teach. But whenever a traveling rabbi was coming through, they would let that rabbi speak instead. And what they would do is actually pretty interesting. It's the exact reverse of what we do. You sit, I stand preaching. It was the other way around. In the synagogues, I would get to sit. So maybe we need to try this one Sunday. I would get to sit, y'all would stand, and that would be one of the longest-winded sermons I've had. Just for fun. I want y'all to know that. But at this point, the buzz is spreading about Jesus Christ. All that he had done in Judea, it's made its way all the way up to Galilee. So he comes into Capernaum, and they ask him to come in and speak. Now, Mark doesn't record for us what Jesus says. Well, really, in the entire book. There's only a couple of sections in the entirety of Mark that are actually teaching sections. They're mostly about the action. He's focused on the miracles. So we don't know what Jesus said to them in the synagogue, but Mark does tell us the people's response. Verse 22, and they were astonished at his teaching. Here's why. For he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. Now, it does say they were astonished. If you notice, it never says they were submissive. Astonished, not submissive. But they hadn't heard someone talk like this before. Because what they were used to were the elders or the scribes would teach them. They'd open up the scrolls. Because you got to remember, in that day, they didn't have Bibles. A select few had scrolls. And so whoever the elder was that was responsible for the scrolls or the scribes, they would open up the scribes and they would read from the law. Or they would read from one of the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah. What the scribes would do, it was common for them to quote other rabbis. But Jesus comes in, and the difference with Jesus, and my Sunday morning group is going to appreciate this, there is no subjectivity to what he's saying. Jesus is speaking in absolutes, objectivity. He's speaking with authority, meaning rule, and this blew their minds because he's turning what they've known their whole life on its head. That was the premise of the entire Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, you remember what he said? I pulled a few of them just so you could see this. Matthew 5:31. It has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. Verse 33, and again you've heard that it was said of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. Verse 34, but I say to you, don't swear at all. Verse 38, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Verse 39, but I tell you not to resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. You've heard this, but I say this. Concrete, absolute, no question, systematic response to what's being said. This is what you've heard. I'm telling you this. What Jesus said, he said with authority, and here's why. He is the authority. But this is all new to the Jews. Is this not the Nazarene you're going to hear? Is he not the carpenter, Joseph's son? Who does he think he is? And so there were some excited. The passage tells us they were astonished, and yet no submission was found in this. Well, and which is why Capernaum is going to receive the condemnation it does. But it's not just the people that were blown away by the Lord. In this, we get introduced to another man as well, a man that was likely a frequent visitor to the synagogue, but we're told that he's a man with an unclean spirit. He has his own response to Jesus Christ as well. Now there was a certain man in the synagogue with an unclean spirit, and here's his response to Jesus. He cried out saying, let us alone. What have we to do with you? Literally, what do we and you have in common? What do we have together? Jesus of Nazareth, did you come to destroy us? And here's the statement, I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God. When Mark says that the demon cried out, it's not giving you the full drama behind what's happening with this demon. It literally means the demon screamed. Well, why scream? Because they're terrified. They're terrified of Jesus. They're terrified of the truth. And when Jesus came, truth came. The Bible tells us that they would disguise themselves as angels of light, pretend to be righteous, just kind of fade away into the shadows. In fact, here's a demon in the synagogue. And something I've always found interesting when you read through all these accounts where Jesus is interacting with these demon-possessed people, not one time do they go after Jesus. They don't attack Jesus. They fall before Jesus. They go after the sinner. They go after the sinful, unrepentant people that would follow Satan in and of themselves. They attack the wicked hearts, but they scream in front of Jesus. The only two, I want you to think about this, the irony here. To this point, the only two that have given confirmation to who Jesus is God from heaven. This is my beloved Son, whom I'm well pleased, after the baptism of Christ, and the demon. I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God. The people were amazed unrepentantly. The demon was terrified without any hope. Well, that's because their ultimate destruction is imminent, and it has been ever since the fall. There's a time appointed for them to be judged. We talked about this in our demon study. What Jesus says, or what the demon says to Jesus in Matthew 8:29, as Jesus comes to the southeast corner of the Sea of Galilee, to the area of the Gadarenes, the one that comes out that names himself Legion. Remember, he comes to Jesus and he says, hey, have you come to torment us before the time? We know there's a time set for this because we know who you are. We know what you're ultimately going to do. You have complete authority over us. It's something I've wondered about this account, just kind of to myself, is how long has this man been in the synagogue and no one knew? How long had he been there on all these Sabbaths with no idea that there was a demon in their presence? And so I want you to think about this, for instance. There could be demons around us today. I'm not saying there is. I personally don't believe there is. But there could be. I don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. But we'd never know. If there was, we'd never know. They don't present themselves to people. Do you know why? They're not afraid of us. Do you think they're afraid of us? They're more powerful than us. Now again, I'm not saying I think they do. I believe they had a very specific purpose in the Bible. That purpose has now been fulfilled. But still, we wouldn't know because they don't fear us. They do fear Jesus. Jesus destroys Satan's stronghold. They're terrified of him. They're terrified of the truth. And you see it in the world today. Why do you think people hate the Bible so much? It's truth. They hate the truth. They speak for their father, the father of lies. They belong to the kingdom of darkness, not the kingdom of light. Now, interesting enough, is Jesus, one, his power, but two, his response. His power is never in question. His response is more so what's interesting to me. Because this demon just confessed who Jesus is, and then verse 25, Jesus immediately rebukes him. The demon is actually saying something good. We know who you are. You're the Holy One of God. Hey, that's a great confirmation. And Jesus tells him, be quiet. Literally saying, and I hate to use this phrase, literally basically telling him to shut up. It's strong language. Hush! And come out. That's all he said. We're not going to read 2 pages of these incarnation things like what you see in movies of how they had to do an exorcism and all of it. He said like it's no big deal. Hush and come out. When he said that, did that demon have a choice? It was already over with. And so if there wasn't enough excitement for the people in the synagogue already with Jesus being there, now they find out that John, who normally sits over here, well, there's a demon in John who's now screaming out before Jesus. Jesus just performs his first miracle in Capernaum, casting a demon out of the guy. And yet, we're only told they're amazed, not submissive. But that's going to be the result for Capernaum. See, Capernaum is going to see so much, hear so much, that Capernaum is going to be held to a higher standard. In fact, Jesus says later on that it's going to be better for Sodom in the day of judgment than it will be for you. If they would have heard or saw what you heard and saw, they would have been repentant. But for now, it will be better for them in the judgment than it will be for you. But this miracle is significant because what happens is going to prove a couple of different things. First and foremost, Jesus has power over this spiritual world. Demons are spiritual beings. But it also shows that Jesus has nothing to do with them. He is truth. They stand for lies. And so when Jesus tells the demon to be quiet, no other words come out of his mouth. Only these inaudible sounds of screaming and screeching as the demon leaves the body of the man. The Bible gives us the description that it's tearing the man in the process of coming out of him. Luke 4, verse 35, I mean, he's convulsing in this process. Well, that's because the demon didn't want to leave. But Jesus had spoken. And so, in all this convulsion and screaming, it served as an eyewitness account of the power of Jesus Christ, which then gave authority to the message of what he just said. And that was the purpose of all the miracles, was to give the authority behind the message that he just said. Do you understand that there is no other time in human history where demon possession is as rampant as it was during the ministry of Jesus? Demon is a fancy term. If you look up and break this down, if you've been on our Wednesday night study, you already know this. Demon means evil spirit. That's all it means. Evil spirit is the same spirit that the Bible refers to as the fallen angels. And here's the thing. They fell in the Old Testament. The Old Testament's already taken place, and yet, we went through this, there is no specific mention of a demon possession. Not by specifics. After the Gospels, after the time of Jesus Christ's ministry, there are only 2 accounts of demon possessions, Acts 16, Acts verse 19, and following that, through the epistles, there is no more mention of it. It's like it just goes away. It stops. You don't hear anything else about it. Which means either demon possession ceased or demons were content to stay under the cover and not be known. But during the ministry of Jesus, when they were around Jesus, they panicked, saying loudly, screaming, screeching, "You are the Son of God," at which point in time Jesus would tell them to be silent. Now, question, why would Jesus tell them to be silent? Why not let them profess him as the Son of God? Sounds to me on the surface like, well, that would be a good thing. Well, it's not hard to figure out. Jesus does not want demons to be his publicist. That would just feed the charge that's going to be coming that Jesus is working under the power of Satan. And so Jesus allows no room, 0 room whatsoever for that thought. He tells them to, again, his words, shut up, don't say a word about this, stay silent. And from that point on, they were quiet. The other reason, of course, would be the timing wasn't right. There was still work to do. You see later on that once all this becomes public, that issues begin to arise with the Pharisees, leading all the way up to the crucifixion. So there's a timing issue as well. But again, you read what it says here with Jesus' power. And this goes back to the problem. Verse 27 says, they were amazed by this. And it sounds like this is good. They're amazed by this. They're even questioning among themselves, well, what is this? What new doctrine is this? What authority is this? He's commanding even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. Well, what in the world is this? In verse 28, you kind of get this parenthetical statement, and immediately his fame spread throughout all the region of Galilee. This power has to be accompanying a new doctrine, which was the exact purpose of the miracles. For some, it's the confirmation that Jesus is indeed the Messiah they were hoping for. The new king, he speaks with authority. He just proved his power over demons. They're trembling in his presence, but something big is about to happen, and the people are amazed. Verse 28, fame is spreading. From this point on, Jesus is going to start being followed by crowds, and they're just going to get bigger. In fact, we're going to keep going not much longer. They're going to try to forcefully make him king after he feeds the 5,000. Word is getting out, and yet there's a big problem. It's not enough to simply be amazed. The demons were terrified, and yet there was no chance they could be saved. You hear twice, 21 and 24, that the people were amazed and would not be saved. It's not enough to be amazed. Because in the end, great judgment was coming for the city that saw more and heard more than any other city around Galilee or Judea or any of the places. But they would never submit to Jesus. It's not enough to have good feelings towards Jesus. It's not enough to have a pleasant passing nod. It's not enough to be amazed. Jesus calls for obedient faith and submission. Now, is amazement a catalyst for that? Well, sure it is. And in Capernaum, there were some that did submit, but by and large they didn't. So we read through this section of Scripture, we're like, hey, this is great. He's starting off really well, and people are amazed, and they're excited, and they did nothing with it. And it's I almost said scad. It's scary and sad. I guess I try to combine the words. Of the same thing today. There's excitement about Jesus. We like the idea of Jesus. I mean, who doesn't love a Savior that died for you? Until you tell them, well, His call is for you to live for Him. Whoa, now hang on. And then all of a sudden you're saying I got to do something. You're saying, no, Jesus said that. You have to submit yourself. You have to repent. You have to make those changes. It's not enough to be amazed. Jesus calls for obedient faith and submission. So a very powerful section here that we're looking at. And again, we're going through these a little bit quicker than I really want to. But it shows you this lesson that when Jesus' ministry begins, He doesn't begin as this soft-spoken preacher coming through. He's already been to Judea. He's already flipped tables. He's now in the synagogue, and now He's casting out demons. Jesus comes with power and with authority. That's His truth with Him, with this message, with everything. He calls for us to be obedient, be faithful, and be submissive to Him in that. So I want to encourage you as we close out our services this afternoon, if you can't say the same thing, that while you're amazed by what Jesus did, by what He offers, if you haven't submitted yourself to Him, that's His call for you. So I want to encourage you again as we close. If you're in need of something this afternoon, if you're there and you're questioning that in your mind, you're not sure, have you submitted yourself? If you haven't been baptized into His body, if you haven't been faithful in living for Him, then I want to encourage you, as Brother Parker leads us in this invitation song, come, let us help you in whatever you may have need of at this time.